Okay, so here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our reading group on Michael Hudson's The Collapse of Antiquity, Part 2. Today we'll be moving through a bit of theory, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. So we start with Greece and everybody's favorite proto-fascist state, Sparta. And I hope we're going to have a good discussion. Feel free to raise your hand digitally or otherwise. If you have questions or if you want to add something, there's also a chat function for those who haven't seen it, where people sometimes ask questions or post additional material. And again, I could monologue. I hope I won't. So everybody feel free to join in at any time. Okay? Great. So last time we were trying to get into the book, and Michael Hudson was pointing out how debt in the ancient world and the debt crisis that shook it again and again have a lot of parallels to our modern time. And he was pointing out various mechanisms by which this is happening. And I think the core feature here, as I understand it, is the transference of interest-bearing debt from the ancient Middle East to Greece and Rome. To Greece first, of course. And in my opinion, it was basically a disembedded social practice gone wild. Because in the ancient Middle East, you always had an institutional setup that allowed for the jubilee, for the cancellation of debt. And there's a difference between two kinds of debt. On one hand, it's the commercial debt, and the other one is the agricultural debt. And the agricultural debt is between the king and his subjects, and the commercial debt is between the richer people who actually go out and trade. And the jubilee was always ever for the agricultural debt. And again, it was only the king who could forgive it. And this you could call these the safeguards, and these were lost as it crossed the sea into Greece. And then it basically went amok. That's basically how it all started. And I would like to start. And what's also important is this is about the 6th and 7th century BC. So we don't have a lot of first-hand resources for that time, something Michael Hudson also acknowledges in his book. Most of those accounts were actually written much later by Plutarch and others. So I'll take it with a grain of sand, but he says that as well. Anyway, so let's get started. I would like to start with a quote from Plutarch. And he says, "They say that hares at one and the same time give birth to one litter, suckle another, and conceive again. But the loans of these barbarous rascals give birth to interest before conception. For while they are giving, they immediately demand payment. While they lay money down, they take it up and then lend what they receive for money lent. And then they make a laughing stock, forsooth, of the scientists who say that nothing arises out of nothing. For with these men, interest arises out of which has as yet no being or existence." And that's a quote from Plutarch's Moralia. It says that we ought not borrow. I think his position is pretty clear here. And as David Graeber said in that, which is interesting, is philosophy seems to appear at the same time as coinage and as these debt crises. So this is basically the period he describes as the axial age, which starts around 700-800 BC and goes to, I think, around 600 AC. And in a way, one might say this is like the dawn of a new era. And sometimes prescient souls can see to the core of a new age in the moment it's born. They could see where this would lead, and this is a bad thing. Strangely, everybody knows from the word go what is the problem, yet there seems no way to change it. Or maybe this is just hindsight and what was written down by the victors. because there were definitely victors and there were definitely losers. So again, we have to be careful not to view the past too much through the lens of the present. There's some big questions here. And our aim is maybe to look at these historical accounts, not only through the filter of Michael Hudson, but also through the theories of David Graeber as developed in his book, That, the First 5,000 Years, and see where they converge and diverge. The cases of Sparta, which we'll cover today, and Athens, which we'll get to next time, will show how two very differently organized societies became subject to the same economic drivers that turned both ultimately into oligarchies that resisted, most in the case of Athens, and in the case of Sparta, sometimes at reform, until a bigger bully, Rome, showed up and had its way with them. Central to this dynamic is war, and there seems to be no large-scale war without coinage. The other feature seems to be class inherent to oligarchies, the drive to accumulate ever more, to sacrifice one's own country and people if that means staying in power. That's from Michael Hudson's intro, and I think these are the big questions. It's like, how did this all happen, and what are the very different elements here? In the document I prepared, there's a rather long quote in the beginning again. So I'll quote this one in parts, and then we'll get into the elements. But I think this one is important because it also is a bit of the setup for what follows throughout the whole book and the mechanisms as Michael Hudson sees them. He says, dark ages and intermediate periods are free-for-alls in which central authority weakens, enabling well-placed opportunists to grab what they can. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, such interregnums saw economic life liberated from palace authority. That occurred in various places. A similar turmoil occurred in the Aegean and Levant after 1200 BC and the end of the late Bronze Age. And here we get to what's going to happen in Greece now, because palaces burned down, towns were abandoned in a region-wide devastation. He mentions the Sea Peoples. There's entire books about these peoples, entirely fascinating, roving hordes of barbarous that come across the ocean and pillage the world, so to speak. But many groups were in motion, and local uprisings are attested. And then all the administrative structures disappeared. But what was left in place were local administrators. You know, they used to be subject to kings, it seems. And then they turned into like they had their local fiefdoms after the central authority broke down. And from there, it all started to expand again. So you have the collapse, you have the breakdown of the structure, it's splintering, and then there's people who take this up. What I found interesting here is that a historian that Hudson quotes is he says that close family kinship was not the factor controlling political life. They actually had follower groups that originated in the early Dark Age as loosely new members and supporters joined these organizations. That's kind of interesting because that means people were kind of free to associate and make new forms of society at the time. I'm not sure if it's definitely the case that all of these had to turn into oligarchies again. Historically, these seem to be the victors. So, and again, there's a lot of it is lost to the darkness of time. That's the deep past. What then happened is the leading families concentrated religious authority in their own hands by controlling hereditary priesthoods, and secular power followed as they monopolized legal power as judges. So you can see again what's happening is at first, you know, these people loosely associate, and then hereditary structures come in, which is something that David Graeber would probably describe as what is it? Not authority. What's his word? Hierarchy, right? As hierarchy. And these again take over, they accumulate wealth, and then there's that crisis, and it all breaks down again. There seems to be a bit the cycle. And then the interesting that happens, and I think this is also where he's, where a lot of people take issue with his book, because he comes up with the rehabilitation of what is historically called the tyrants. Yeah, not until the 5th century do we begin to get firm dates and events. Again, a lot of that stuff is lost. In the absence of written records and reliable history dating from the early period, we must rely on what was written many centuries later to describe the 7th and 6th century revolts that brought populist leaders to power in Corinth, Sicyon, Megara, and other cities. Almost no records exist to explain how the early problematic debts came into being, but most of the surviving history of this early period is about the debt revolts and demands for land redistribution that extended down through Solon's reforms in Athens in 594. The leaders who brought reforms were called tyrants. By the 4th century, the word had come to imply an autocratic policy. Yet, as recent scholarship has emphasized, the tyrants set in motion the reforms that led to democracy. Okay, so what does all that mean? In a way, we have the overall theme of large parts of the book. Again, it starts with the collapse, what comes after, then, as I described, the loose formation of new groups, then the introduction of hierarchy through hereditary power in various forms. And what I find interesting is something I stumbled on when I prepared this. I'm not sure you can translate this 100% from the German, but there seems to be some dictum that historians use. And it's basically, the farther the chronicler is removed from the events, the more precise his descriptions. So we should keep this in mind when you read Plutarch and he's talking about events that happened 200-300 years before or even earlier. So what do we know? Yeah, what we know is that populist leaders, or what we would possibly conceive of as populist leaders, rose in several Greek city-states around the 7th and 6th century BC. And then there's some theories as to why. One popular theory is, for example, advances in military technology. We had, they learned how to forge iron. You know, it was the end of the Bronze Age, the beginning of the Iron Age. And they had these, the famous hoplite formations, where like large groups of people need to train a long time in order to be effective on the battlefield. And I said, maybe this was a driver for democratic reforms. Aristotle, as quoted by Michael Hudson, he points to elite infighting because these developments seem to have happened or started to happen earlier than these developments in military technology. What Aristotle said is there's dissident aristocrats, and they made themselves leaders of the opposition, where greed blocked civic prosperity. Another explanation would be they wanted to be in charge, since it's quite often the sons of the unemployed, useless offspring of the bourgeoisie who start revolutions because they want to be in charge. That's my personal interpretation. Solon in Athens, being a famous example, he was a member of the nobility, but of the lesser nobility. He was not very rich, and so he kind of fits the bill. And it's also kind of interesting is that the word tyrannis equals demagogy, which is the root in demos, the people. So you can see how all these things are linked. Even if we today, when we think of a demagogue, it's negatively connotated. But the root of the word is demos, the people again. And we should always keep in mind that history, of course, is written by the winners. Writers unsympathetic to democracy gave an autocratic meaning to the word, possibly. Tyrannical was the use of power to restrain privileges and canceling debts. I mean, this is something I can see. If you have a lot of money and a lot of land as a group of people, and then an individual shows up and starts taking that away from you, you would conceive of that as tyrannical. What is undeniably true is that oligarchs would want to discredit any form of power or organization that would check their own. And what seems to come through the centuries to us from the written record is that tyrants widely used their power to confiscate the elite's land. Now, again, there's more than one possible explanation for this. One would be to advance the state. Another would be to take power away from their opponents. So, you know, but I think all these things were in the mix, probably. You know, there's seldomly just one reason. Here's another quote, which I found interesting. Treating the drive to accumulate wealth as a disease that led to hubris, they were known for criticizing the greed and money lust that was causing social confrontation. And what I found interesting, which is something I mentioned in the last session as well, is that the Greeks actually had a word for wealth addiction. They called it pleonexia. So there's a fixed term for this kind of behavior, which we see very much in the modern world as well, I think. Interestingly enough, tyrants extended the franchise. They gave it to landless. They gave it to foreigners. Their reforms led to consultations that standard voting rights and milli-statutes, a move from kinship as central to geographic voting areas, away towards forms of exchange. And then this is a thing I will probably come back to again and again. In David Graeber's The First 5,000 Years, in chapter 5, David found 3 ways in which economic life in a society can morally be organized. And that was baseline communism, hierarchy, and exchange. And Michael Hudson, I think, concerns himself mostly with the latter two. And you could see this as a move going away from hierarchy towards exchange. And if you're poor and indebted, that actually might be a good offer you're getting. This is a good deal because you're getting out of debt, and there's some rules being instituted, and this is much better than a bunch of hereditary people telling you what to do based on how they feel every day. Right. So that's basically the intro. And what I find also important is Hudson frames the introduction of coinage as bringing equality and justice, not as the cause of coming debt crisis, since debt does not need coins, but rather facilitating trade. The problem is not money, but money lending, he says. So I could keep going. Anybody have any thoughts on this?
Yeah. Can I maybe at least I would like to ask some questions
Sure.
in the middle. Yeah, and then continue, please. It's so helpful. Amazing. Thank you. So can you elaborate on a connection between tyranny, opposition, according to Michael Hudson, democracy and oligarchy again? And I was thinking about the current equivalent, because whenever we talk about tyranny in ancient Greece, it's probably not directly connected to the tyranny in today's world. As much as maybe Michael wants to make these connections, it looks to me it's a little bit different, because now we're dealing with this enormous, you know, corporations and government like corporations, and that wasn't probably the case. I don't know, just yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I understand it, I think what we understand or what we think of when we hear the word tyranny is very much what Michael Hudson would call an oligarchy. And in today's world, it would be the same thing, because the rules are written by the oligarchs. In looking back at antiquity, what he says is that back in the 6th and 7th century, at least in Greece and Rome, in Greece as we're talking about it now, for various reasons, debt crisis started to happen. And the driver there probably were the ruling class, which was not an individual, as in a king or a tyrant in that case, but a class, the oligarchy, who monopolized the sources of production, and through that took more control of everything. And then he says, like, to break this power, you needed the tyrant. Yeah, and if you wanted to look at this in terms of modern equivalent, if you want to, you can look at this from the good point of view and the bad point of view. Yeah, because for us, we think, okay, everybody's living in a democracy.
Can you say why it was a crisis, a debt crisis? Who was it a crisis for? What
for the majority of the population?
Was a moral crisis or a crisis for the people?
Yeah, I mean, the debt crisis means basically that the majority of the population, or ever more people, get into debt to rich people, and then they lose their land, they lose their freedom. They are being made penniless and maybe turned into slaves or serfs. You know, there's different gradations to this depending on the society. And as you lose your freedom, essentially, the power in the society rests with the people who lend out the money. And that's also what's called the debt crisis throughout history. And I think there's some parallels to this today. Yeah, Nika?
Yeah, so if I will think about parallel, I will think about what's going on in Africa when basically French, let's say in these three countries that has rebelled recently, French were owning everything. So they were like just like this collective oligarch, or their oligarchical clans or corporations would just owe everything, extract resources, and then they make these elections for 54 years. We're like, call it democracy, and for 54 years the one family would like constantly win the election, and only the military power, the junta was able to remove them. And that's probably what Michael Hudson will call tyranny, because now they have these tyrants, yes, who doesn't have a democratic legitimacy. They were just like a bodyguard who removed the bad guy, who basically himself personally robbed the country and gave it to his buddies who benefit him.
I think the mechanism you describe is absolutely right. But what I think is important is the outcome. Yeah. So if you basically say we have a revolution, there's like some oligarch. Okay, you can have, if you have an oligarchy in. I mean, there's a difference. So what you'd have now, if you look at the current crisis I forgot the name, which African country it is. Like Gabon, I think it's Gabon.
Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, but I think it's more.
No, I think it's Gabon or something. It doesn't matter. In the end, what happened is, like you said, you had some guy in power, some family in power for a long time, and then the military stepped in and removed him. And I think it's not quite clear where this is going right now. And the question here is this like a single family in power, in which case you can't really speak of a class of people that are in power. When you look at the United States today, you think of the billionaires, the really rich people who control the political environment, and you say like, okay, this is an oligarchy. The other guy, he might be a tyrant in the modern connotation of the word.
No, in Africa it's not, because he's also represents like none of these African leaders. They represent only the family. They're not sovereign. They represent the colonial corporations.
Yes. I mean, these are being empowered by this. But I think like when I said it's important about the outcome. If you have someone who, like, you have an existing power structure which is removed, and you have an individual or a very small group of people stepping in, and if they then decide to use their newly gained power to improve the lot of the majority of people, then you would say that's a good thing, right? If you just exchange one dictator for another, then it really doesn't matter, you know? And I think this is where he draws the line. He says like, okay, look, we have a class in power that is basically destroying the planet. And if we want change, and somebody steps in, an individual or a specific group of people who have, a different outcome in mind, a positive outcome, something that will be of use to the majority of people, then it would be a positive tyrant, so to speak. Yeah. And I realize we should be careful here because it's not black and white, right? But if you say, like, for example, from the examples he gives in Greece, when he says you had city-states that were governed by a ruling elite, an oligarchy, who was monopolizing land and money and basically wealth. and the lot of the common people was continuously getting worse, right? And there was no investment, let's say, in civic infrastructure. And then you have somebody step in who would move these people out of power and then use his newfound power, to forgive debts, to give back everybody the land, to free slaves, and start investing, I don't know, in the harbor or something like this. Then that would be a positive development, even though I guess you wouldn't call it a democracy. Yeah, so there's different gradations here, and I'm not advocating for this. I want to make sure. Okay?
No. I'm just trying to figure out what Michael Hudson is actually mean, but we should ask him also when he comes.
I think this is very much what he means.
But so what is the difference? So is he name basically he's saying that whatever we call democracy is oligarchy, and then alternative to oligarchy is tyranny. That is not ideal, but the better thing. So my question is, Michael Hudson Spartan democracy anywhere whatsoever?
That's a good. I can't answer that question, but I'm pretty sure he means that for most of us, what we think of democracy is actually an oligarchy. That's I'm pretty sure of that. And he also, if he says like we want, let's say, a group of people in power who want to advance the state, because I think he's very much in favor of the state. Then a positive example for him would be China. And under current circumstances, I mean, you cannot completely argue against that, because the Chinese lifted 400 million people out of poverty over the last 30 years. While in our countries, you know, poverty is increasing. Life expectancy in the US has recently dropped below that of the United States. No, of China, excuse me. Yeah. And you have these developments, and then if you look to China and like there's some bank who has problems, and then the banker disappears. Again, I'm not advocating for that. And you look at our bankers who, you know, wreck the economy and get bonuses. You can see how this might look appealing.
Okay, that's understandable. So what I don't understand, can I just ask more questions about what you, so what is, how does it happen, this connection between end of Greece, beginning of Rome? What is Michael Hudson writing about now?
Well, that's going a little farther than I'm actually prepared for. But basically what he says, we have in all these states, if you take, like, if we look at Athens next time, we'll get to Sparta, hopefully in a few minutes. These are very differently organized economically, okay? Yet at the same time, they all went down the same route at some point. They all had oligarchies. There was money lending at interest was introduced. That led to the monopolization of land and power in the hands of very few people. You had this ruling elite who, and more people lost their freedom and their land, basically. You know, you had these developments over the long term weakened these countries. And the difference, I think, the main difference, and you had these developments in parallel for a certain time in Greece and Rome. The difference is that Rome at some point just became much more powerful, and it became, you know, the biggest bully in the region. And at some point it just swept aside everybody else. So you could say like all these developments were happening at the same time, and the state that became more and more powerful was Rome over time. And then in the end, there was just Rome.
Is it any explanation why exactly Rome got, you know, the win over everybody else?
It's a good question. I don't know.
Because if I understand correctly, what Michael is writing is he is presenting a different ways of social organization and power structures in a society, and he's judging how people feel or live in a different frameworks. And he's saying, okay, like it looks like an tyranny is better to be in an oligarchy, because oligarchs will just suck all your blood and don't care, and tyrants will.
There is a bit of truth to that. Yeah, again, and if you look at this through the lens of David's theories, when he says like, look, you have like basically, if you look at the organization of the economy, what are the ways you can do this? You can say you have baseline communism, like from everybody according to their ability, to each of according to their needs. This is something you can do. And then you can have hierarchy, which is basically tradition. You know, we do this because it happened before. And but all these things, they establish permanent connections in a society between the different members, non-regarding where they are positioned. And then you have exchange. Exchange is something that happens once, basically, and if the exchange is done, everybody walks away. But when you introduce debt into the whole thing, you kind of fix it in place. You know, as long as the debts exist, you know, if you can't pay it off, you can't walk away. And once this dynamic,
I think, sorry.
Yeah, once this dynamic got going, it was very hard to get rid of it. I mean, without trying to take away too much from the end of the book. I mean, by the end, Rome is like in a state of permanent civil war, where different parties try to grab control of the state in order to exploit what's left of the infrastructure, so to speak. And this also makes kind of, personally, you know, I'm not a very religious person. I was always wondering what made Christianity so appealing to people. And if you read Hudson, by the end, when you look at the state of the Roman Empire, I mean, it must have been a hellscape, you know, for the common people, because there was constantly armies moving through. There was always fighting. There was always more taxes. There were ever a little more rights. Most people were losing their land and freedom. So at some point, you just say like, well, you know, this also makes martyrdom interesting, right? Because if I'm gonna die, I might as well die for a cause, right? So I'll die for God and Jesus and all that. And this is much better than just dying in the dirt, you know. Anyways, but this is moving forward. If I want to go back to the observations, maybe a moment. Like, we're nearly through the chapter, I think.
I think you want to tell about Sparta.
Yeah, well, and then we get to Sparta, yeah. And one thing, that's the moment, let me see. So what I found interesting is like a statement he made: you don't need coins for debt, which is true. You can have a debt crisis even without coins. You could just, you know, have a bad harvest, you go into debt because you get grain you need for next year's sowing. You can get it from a rich person, from the temple, it doesn't matter. But at some point you have to pay it back. And so it's easy to go into debt, even if there's not an interest, if there's no coins, you know. So that you don't need that. But what I found interesting is, so if you have coinage as a form of achieving justice, you don't need coins for justice. Yeah, you can also kind of, it's like the close-knit village community David described in that, when he said, okay, I need a pig and you need shoes, but you don't need shoes and we can't trade. This is because everybody knows what everybody owes to everybody else. So justice, everybody knows the score, everybody knows the rules, so you don't need coins for justice. Justice is basically everybody's doing right by everybody else, and then you go back to baseline communism, which is kind of absent here. And the interesting part, which he doesn't mention, is that coins were cast to pay soldiers. So what we saw in the different areas David looked at in the axial age chapter in that is that without the coins, the war machine wouldn't function, because kings kind of were thinking about, how do I supply my army? I don't want to do it myself. So I raise taxes. People have to give me the coins. I actually give them the coins. I give the coins to the soldiers pay the suppliers pay me taxes. And it goes back and forth. Yeah. So that part is kind of missing. And I would really like to hear his opinion on this one. Okay, and maybe towards the end here, another quote from Aristotle: the rich, which he calls fools blessed with fortune, believe that their wealth gives them the claim to being treated as superiors and the means to deal with any resistance. Everything can be bought, and hence treat others with hubris and contempt, leading them to injustices. The role assigned to Zeus and other gods was to punish hubris and uphold dike and eunomia, which were the proper and right way to do things or to live your life. So again, there's a very strong condemnation from somebody we see as one of the fathers of Western thought, right? Okay, so I think this is the most important stuff from that chapter, maybe. Yeah, this is basically it. Okay, so Sparta, anybody have final questions?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So in your notes, there are a couple of sentences. War is a driver. In Greece, the war with Persia catalyzed the spread of interest-bearing debt. Cultivators turned mercenaries and needed to be paid. So this is contention point here in David's analysis. It is also mentioned, but he tells that interest-bearing logic of calculating of interest comes from Persia to Greece in about same time, and seems like Michael Hudson expands this argument, saying, well, the adoption of interest-bearing logic from Persia to Greece happened because the war, because cultivators needed to be paid. Here, again, we have continuation from David Graeber explaining how this happens. But we also know that Michael Hudson disagrees with David's logic, and then the question is why cultivators need to be paid.
Okay, so first of all, not everything that is written down in this document is Michael Hudson. Some of that is me, some of that is David Graeber. Okay, that's number one. And what I tried to say before, the connection he doesn't make is for coinage and war. So for him, he says coinage is introduced as a way of making things better, to facilitate trade, for example. And while David Graeber said, look, coinage and war are inherently interlinked. This is a point Michael Hudson actually doesn't make. For him, it's let's say if you have a society based on hierarchy, let's call it basically feudalistic, and you move to a society, based on exchange. You need the coins basically. Coins are a good feature for this. And at the same time, you don't really need it. But what you need the coins definitely for is to pay the soldiers. Because you don't want to supply your army yourself. I mean, I think this is the big difference between, this is something I would really like to ask Michael Hudson. This is a big difference between him and David. Because David said, okay, look, if you're the king, you own the gold mine, right? So why do you need taxes? You need the taxes because you don't want to supply your army yourself, because it's a hassle, So what do? I put in taxes. Everybody has to pay me taxes, but people don't have coins. So I give the coins to my army. So they have to buy stuff from my soldiers, and then the money travels back to me. And this way you get the circle, And at the same time, if you can buy more and more stuff with coins, as coins become ubiquitous, and soldiers have coins, it makes sense for people to accept thing in exchange. As before, you'd use maybe that for long distance trade. So it's good for the king to kind of set it up like this. So yes, there is going to be more trade. At the same time, you're creating the conditions for large-scale warfare, because you can raise ever more soldiers. You can say, like, look, you guys, you're not going to be cultivators anymore. You'll be mercenaries. We'll give you money. You don't have to, and we'll have slaves that will till your fields. And you can buy those slaves with the money from the war we are making. And this is what David meant by the, what was it? The slavery military industrial complex, right? So this is the big difference, in my opinion.
Okay, yes, there is this logic coins as bureaucracy to supply. There is another logic where coins are tokens of exemption from corvée labor, but what is a bit more specific here, you can do war without coins. You can do debt without coins. You cannot have mercenaries without coins. The purpose of coins as apolitical money, as something that you can, if you fight for some kind of political unity for a kingdom, and the king promises you a land, a wife, a servant for your services. Well, you go, you do the war, you return, you get what you promised, but you can't exactly then go and spend it in some other kingdom, right? So what coins like metal coins, gold coins as universal accepted currency do, as apolitical currency do, is ability to fight for someone else's kingdom.
Yeah, if I understand you correctly, I mean you can actually, I mean you get coins in a way they were most useful in the area where they were struck, but they were transferable between different city states. That wasn't an issue. And if you're a mercenary, I think one of my favorite quotes from that was like what did they get? Pretty much the definition of a bad credit risk is a heavily armed itinerant soldier.
So, absolutely, yes. So we are in agreement on this one. What is more interesting is how is this conducive to spreading of interest-bearing practice from Persian states to Greek states?
Well, if okay, I think this is not how the practice started. The practice started in trade. Traders would come over from the Middle East and via temples would acquire goods, and they would pay for this in silver, for example. And then the local people in charge who would gain silver through this, and then they could start. And once they have a certain amount, they say this is kind of cool. In the beginning they would just use it for commercial debts, and at some point there was a switch to agricultural debt, and then you wouldn't just borrow grain anymore. You would borrow silver to buy grain, for example. And if you have people, then before you would have, like, if you have a situation that's based on hierarchy, you would go to the local lord and you would get your grain, as I understand it. And now you go to the moneylender, you get the silver, and then you can go buy the grain from whoever, right? So this seems practical on some level, I guess, but he doesn't go much deeper into it. I think this is basically the mechanism for him. Yeah. Nika.
Yeah, so sorry we're running out of time and we have to go to Sparta. I just wanted to ask again about debt and China and silver. So David is writing that basically all the expansion in Latin America happened because the Europeans wanted to get goods from China and they didn't have anything to exchange. So the only useful things they can give to Chinese was silver. And that's why they robbed the colonies to provide them to get their precious everything. But the Chinese, the way how they managed the Chinese state, the way how they managed the mines was very different, looks like, than the way how Michael Hudson described the mining and coin in David's too, and coinage and the war machine was managed in Rome and Greece. And I think David originally took all his information and he used the research of Michael Hudson on antiquity. Mm-hmm. So there is a difference between these two arrangements, Chinese and ancient Greece and Rome. Now we're looking at the Hudson book about Rome and Greece.
Yeah,
but
it's different
in the same time, he's talking a lot in his video talks and generally thinking about contemporary China. So, and that is probably much different story. We cannot just tell all coin just is for war,
Yeah.
because in China it wasn't for war. Like a
It
silver
was
coin was no, in China. You remember?
originally.
Hmm?
The situation that you're describing when China was getting silver to buy slaves of or to free people by casting coins out of body of some mountain. This is a time when China overthrow the yoke of Mongolian yoke that was struggling China. It happens much later, and
Yeah.
we are talking about 700 BC when people invented coinage. When people invented coinage, it was also in David's account that they invented coinage everywhere. In first in Libya, but very soon in India and in China, they also invented coinage. It is like almost 800 years before, or something like that, before the situation with Spanish gold. By then, Chinese moved to paper money, then to debt money, then to metal money once again. And because paper money was colonial currency of Mongols, and they use metal money to diversify from that, and this is where this drive comes from. So there is a missing quite a lot of transformations.
Yeah. And again, I think this is an interesting point, but again, this is in a different historical area, so the mechanisms are different. And to be honest, I don't have all the details present, so I don't feel comfortable answering that question right now, to be honest. But if everybody's fine, we're gonna move to Sparta for a moment. Or Michael, do you have something to add?
I was just going to comment on one of the things that might inform this type of debate that Nika's raising is that Michael Hudson seems to use a historical framework and some economic theory and a focus on the debt and the politics, the political economy there. What's slightly missing that David Graeber kind of informs his work with is he seems to use an understanding of some contemporary anthropology and mixes that in with the historical work. So in particular, then an understanding of what a non-hierarchical society is like, how decision-making is done in those types of communities, and an understanding of, say, democracy by sortition, or how do people develop a consensus. If there's no coercion in a community, then the decision-making is done in a different way, because you kind of have to convince everybody. You can't just vote and say, do it, we're now going to do it. Or you don't have a group that monopolizes the resources. You get a vote, they're justified to take those resources and then do whatever the majority vote was. And so in that sense, there's all of this kind of way in which a society and an economy and a sort of sets of how people do their life, whatever the economics of exchanging food and doing things and raising families and caring for people is done. That is how that happens when there isn't coercion is quite tricky to find in societies that are big history books full of, the history is a history of coercion, like Greece, like Rome. So I think that'll be part of asking Michael Hudson, how is it you talk about these missing elements, because those missing elements are always silent in history. Like when David Graeber writes about there never was a West, or writes about democracy emerges in between these spaces. So how do you think about how those show up as a sort of crack in the way history is written about coercion and debt? And that's maybe part of what's going on in an argument that a tyrant is actually drawing upon regular popular people's desire to have their own freedom, have a better way of exchanging against the oligarchy. So it might not mean the tyrant is great, but it does set the tyrant against the oligarchy. And there's maybe other times where a tyrant that gains power then leaves behind those the engagement that they have, of the populist engagement.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is correct. And this is also what I put into the notes. Again, I think chapter 5 here is really important from David's, that where again you have like these three forms. You have hierarchy, you have exchange, you have baseline communism, and baseline communism is missing here. There's maybe different explanations for this. It might also be that, you know, once this mechanism gets going, you know, baseline communism gets relegated to the sides. On the other hand, as we know, this is what probably would be called history from below. This is sidelined in the way history is taught regularly. What was the history of the common people? That there was a lot of baseline communism, for example, in Middle Ages Europe. Yeah, and that only went away again later. But then we move through the different cycles of history, and then we get to the present. And let's now turn our eyes to Sparta for a moment before our time runs out, so I can at least talk about that for a moment. Okay, so again, everybody's favorite proto-fascist state, Sparta. They had issues with debt and land accumulation as well. The solution was conquering their neighbors. Yeah, so they in a way they had a local empire. They decided to kind of keep things just where they were. They conquered Messenia, which was next to them, and they enslaved the population. And then you had very much the same dynamic as in Rome later on, where you would have like the sons of the common people would get serve in the army and have slaves and till the field, which is basically the Spartan arrangement. The difference is, for the time and place, Sparta was pretty much self-sufficient. They had their own iron mines, they had clay, they had all the things they needed at the time. So they didn't need to go outside. So in a way, they were very warlike, and they were always preparing for fights. But it was mostly police action, because they had to keep the Helots, the Messenians, down. Difference here is other cities like Athens, they had colonies. Rome had its Ager Publicus, where the land they had conquered, they would give away to individual people. And again, you need someone to do the dirty work. And in that case, in Sparta, it was the Messenians. And kind of to keep things quiet, they also had laws that said displays of wealth were forbidden. So this very austere image we have of the Spartans, it was there to keep the social calm. You know, while there definitely was inequality and definitely richer Spartans and poorer Spartans, these people were still in theory equal. They were free members of the Spartan elite, but some had more than others. But you know, you don't show it. And there's like a quote that's often cited. It says, like, nobody knows if this is really true or not. There's like the Delphic oracle once said, love of money will destroy Sparta, nothing else. I don't know at what time this quote first showed up, but this is definitely how the story ends. Interestingly enough, credit again did not become a serious problem until much later. So in the 8th, 7th, 6th, 5th century, there was no credit problem, but they managed to have debt accumulation without that. They banned gold and silver, and they also banned trade, because, and this is also a way to kind of how they were very insular. Said we have what we need. We don't need trade, and having trade is also something where you come in touch with, you know, the bad ideas of the foreigners, so to speak. We want to keep ourselves pure. Very fascist. And there was an interesting comment Michael Hudson made. He said Sparta was a rentier state without being monetized or debt financed. So this is an interesting thing. So that you managed to have all the really bad stuff even without coins and without debts. But it was hierarchical in a way.
It was oligarchy, yeah? Because it was this oligarchy of the Spartans over
the oligarchy of the Spartans over the conquered Messenians, which were, you know, in the periphery, so to speak.
Yeah.
And a funny quote I really liked.
I mean, wouldn't we think of that as like the early way in which hierarchy arises, that you have a sort of an equality of people, but one village conquers another village and then takes them as slaves, and then
yes.
You still have a sort of equality amongst your own people, but that opposition, and I wonder, that's a different way to kind of think of the of this from exactly the three types of economic process that David Graeber outlines in chapter 5 of Debt.
Yeah, absolutely. In a way, this is how the state gets started, which is also something David said, because first you conquer the people and you pillage and you rape, right? And then you turn it into tradition, which means you have taxes and you have the right of prima noctis. So, and that's it's how it gets morality and legitimacy through tradition, so to speak. And this is basically pretty much what happened here. But what I found funny is if you think of Sparta, right, you think of like these are the most warlike people ever. These are a warriors society. And he said the in-kind system in Sparta left Sparta without the means to meet expenditures because they never had any money, requiring foreign payments in silver. That lack led to the withdrawal from the war against Persia. They left early, so to speak. And the other one, it made them reluctant to enter the Peloponnesian War against Athens, whose finances were at the peak in the 5th century, which is something we get to next time. And then the seeming irony is that this most warlike people was never ready for war, except domestically against Messenian helots. Every unusual expenditure found the Spartans totally unprepared, aggravated by Sparta's aristocracy dodging the few fiscal obligations that existed, which is also kind of interesting again, because rich people don't like to pay taxes, right? Here we go again. Okay. In the end, what is interesting is when the war of Sparta against Athens started, the big thing in Greek history before basically its end is the Peloponnesian War between like a group of cities allied with Athens and a group of cities allied with Sparta. And Athens lost that war. But the Spartans didn't win through their martial powers. They basically won because they accepted Persia's dominance and money. And then they got all the money to again hire mercenaries who would row the triremes, and this is how they defeated the Athens navy, basically, because they just paid much more money for the people to fight for them, which means that a landlocked country beat one of the premier naval nations of its time, and they were financed basically by the Persians. So that's basic, and this is the beginning of the end for Sparta, because the next thing that happens is, of course, now you've won, and you can institute military governments all over Greece, and these new military governors who are they start to exploit the local population, and they have all this money, and they take this money and they come back home, and the old elites, the hierarchical elites, yeah, whose power was based on land ownership, they're all of a sudden confronted with people whose power is based on money, on how rich they are. Yeah, and this basically destroys Spartan society. And then in the end, they try to fight a war against Persia. They lose. They're defeated again by a coalition of Greek cities. They lose Messenia, so they cannot, continue on as they have done before. And then they fade into obscurity until at some point, first Macedonia rises, and then Rome takes everything. And that's the end of Sparta. And this is very brief and abbreviated, but we're running out of time. And I figured maybe somebody wants to talk about this as well. Any questions?
I would want to discuss separately proto-fascism, because fascism is, in other words, like democracy and fascism is the two words that now everybody is using, and they like clearly have so many different meanings.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is true, but I think modern definition of fascism is you disagree with me. This seems
yeah,
to
I don't think that's true. I mean, obviously fascism is a specific form of governance that is corporatist, focuses on a link between a socialist kind of help the people type attitude that is also militaristic and patriarchal, and so it incorporates a type of politics that disables grassroots democracies against the rich by talking the same rhetoric. And that was the sort of genius of the fascism that derived in Milan. But many people talk about fascism as the kind of just the militaristic, patriarchal kind of frameworks and the sort of psychology that is behind that, which I think, maybe that's an appropriate use of the word. I mean, technically, as a political science definition, it has a specific meaning in the 20th century and maybe before that. But people can see things that psychologically and the level of violence or discrimination look like fascism.
Look, let's put it like this. Academically speaking, you're absolutely right. But I think the way the term fascism is used very often right now is basically people who consider themselves notionally on the left or on the right or any other position would use it for everybody else who disagrees with them. This is basically the level of online discourse. That's what I meant. Yeah, so I think most people are completely, I mean, fascism is notoriously hard to define in many ways. I mean, Umberto Eco once wrote this, for anybody who's interested, Umberto Eco wrote like a 5 or 10 page thing about what fascism actually means. And he has like 10 points that are needed to identify fascism, although you don't need all of them. There's like combinations. It's basically you look at the thing and it's it, but it's not always the same definition. So in a way, what I meant is when I said Sparta is proto-fascist, this is very much what you described in many ways, because there's lots of elements in this society, and but of course it's not what we have today.
Yeah, I just bought a book today. That's why I'm interested. I think it's a very interesting discussion. We should hold a panel about what is fascism. I agree that it's such after World War II, it's become such a strong weapon that people are naming each other. And if you don't care about your population, that looks like it's one thing that not make you fascist, So let everybody die in your country and conquer everybody else. And that's, you're not a fascist because you don't have the corporative state who's taking care of the local population.
Yeah.
So I was just going to go ahead.
I mean, in a way, is right now we have like unprecedented union activity in the United States, for example, which on at first glance is really great. On the other hand, if you just employ everybody in the military industrial industry and give them good union wages, I'm not really sure they're going to go for world peace, love, and brotherhood. I put by the way, I put the paper from Umberto Eco in the notes. But Michael, go ahead. If you're still there.
Sorry. So I was just going to comment on your remarks that initially Sparta had trouble because they didn't have money. They didn't want to be part of the cash economy and the coinage. They banned gold, so they couldn't, invest in their own warfare. And it's just it's quite an interesting thing because it suggests there's a bit of a gradation there. There's a story about in anthropology about the primitive war machine that lots of primitive societies are very violent and warlike, but they don't have any kind of resources, and so their wars end up a bunch of big tribes threatening each other like a street fight with spears, but they don't actually get close enough, more like a riot, and maybe someone gets killed, but then it's over, right? And then say Deleuze and Guattari often claim, take this story and say, here's what these primitive societies are like. But when you add a sort of wizard, somebody who brings in the money and the finance and the rhetoric, they capitalize warfare, and then you get mass deaths, which is certainly what happens in the 20th century. The new technology with mass deaths is organized in some ways. The fascism is actually, that wizard who draws together.
Yeah.
And if
Maybe
And
first,
so this is actually an interesting thing because there is some obviously resources, money behind them, and they are kind of in some ways proto-fascist, but it's not the same as just a street fight, the Spartan war.
No.
And then ultimately they do get drawn into trying to get finance to make their war happen.
yes, but like one thing is it's not like the Spartans didn't have money. They had their own iron money. It's kind of funny. They had the iron. They would apparently, when they heated it, they would dip it into vinegar, so it would become useless for any other use. You know, so all you could, you know, it's like basically if somebody wants, and it was, I think, mostly along the lines of what David Graeber would call a social currency. So it was used to rearrange social relationships. And it was also very much useless for like doing something on the sly because it was so big and bulky. So if somebody's moving money, everybody would know it, you know. But they didn't want to take, so a lot of the stuff that happened was in kind. So if you had like a Spartan farm, so to speak, or you're a Spartan plantation owner, you would have responsibility to your community to produce certain stuff. You know, what's the word? I don't know, grain, clay, iron, whatever. You had to produce this stuff and give it to the state. And again, but what Michael Hudson also writes is that, you know, the rich people in Sparta always try to dodge their responsibility, you know, so and especially in times of war, it's like you have to give a little more. No, I don't want to, you know, and so that was the problem. So the system they had figured out for themselves worked really well as long as they stayed away from the rest of the world. And once they started engaging with other societies, which, by the way, was through the means of war at the end, that didn't work anymore. You know, if you they fought on the side of the Greeks, basically against the Persians. You know, everybody knows the story. You know, this is Sparta and all this. I mean, the Thermopyles that really happened, where they stopped the Persians for a moment. And but they retreated because they didn't have the resources to keep fighting. And later on, they basically were bought out by the Persians, you know, and then they could hire all the mercenaries they needed to defeat Athens. So this is where they were then co-opted, so to speak, out of their traditional, honorable way of life. And then money actually, in the end, really destroyed Sparta.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting, the idea that there is this kind of traditional way of life and their life doesn't involve this additional level of capital, even if they have their warfare is somewhat capitalized within their own context. And that somehow we end up seeing them as, oh, their pure life was ruined because, of course, I forget the name of the anthropologist who writes on the sort of primitive war machine that Deleuze and Guattari take up as sort of quite naively in some ways, and say, and there's this image, that these tribes are the noble, savage kind of people who are pure people, and they just have this sort of big street fight as war. And David Graeber then, of course, writes about all the hierarchies within their community, within the community, like hierarchies of men over women and all this, and really argues that these are not free and fair societies, but maybe their unfreeness and unfairness are at different scales. So it's an interesting kind of comparison. It suggests a way to look at a lot of this much more complex.
Yeah, and also what you see is the moment coinage is introduced, the armies really grow in size. And once coinage moves out of the picture, you know, the big armies disappear. This is also something David wrote about in his chapter on the Axial Age. So there definitely seems to be a connection between coinage and war. Again, this is the part, I guess that would be a good question for Michael Hudson.
Sounds like we have lots of questions for him. Maybe we can get him to come next time.
Yes, should we, Christian, do you want to list the questions, or do you want to first go through the chapters, like maybe in more like...
I would like to advance a little bit more into the book. You know, I'm not against having him here, But I think if we could get in like 2 or 3 1 or 2 sessions more, then we'd be deeper into the material. Also, I'm always trying to kind of look in parallel at what David wrote. So I guess if we invite him, we don't want him to monologue, right? We would like to have a discussion, and then we should.
Yeah. Maybe should you share this Google Doc with the comments, because then we can all write questions to Michael, you know, and at the end we will have collection of the questions from everyone, and you can just moderate that.
I mean, the document is basically public, even though I would, if we're using it sort of in-house, that's fine. Everybody who wants to add info comments, so it's free. People can add comments. It's not a problem. Yeah, I mean, we should probably at least move through Greece, and this would probably take 1 or 2 more sessions, and then I think we would have something.
I think I'd be excited to get him pretty sooner rather than later, but and maybe it's just up to us to make sure that we've got more reading. I haven't done any of the reading really yet, other than thank you, Christian, for all of this stuff that you've done. But I think once there's a bunch of us, we can make sure that it doesn't become a monologue by just him, although he is pretty obviously knowledgeable.
I'm doing my best.
Should we just have another session where we kind of try to
Maybe,
go from beginning till end, and then we invite Michael to this to the third one? And I think now we're working more on the website, so maybe we can turn on the comments on your page in your room, if you're okay with that, Christian, and then people can start to write questions as comments, and you can moderate them.
Yeah, I mean, the risk, one final thing I would like to add here, the risk here is this. I mean, Michael Hudson does have a huge internet following. If we open this, you know, I don't know how many people inside the Museum of Care environment feel free to participate in discussion and add comments and whatever. But when we open this up to basically the Michael's legions, that might become very one-sided very fast.
What is Michael's legions? Okay,
oh,
no, the comments is only on the website of Museum of Care in your room, and you moderate them, so that's fine, that's safe. And we just need to collect all these questions. I didn't write them down, but if you will, that will be great.
Yeah, if people want to post, I mean, you can post the questions in the document itself. Everybody can comment.
I think.
And then the document, then it would be at the appropriate area. You know, it's like this part. Can we go in deeper here? Could we ask Meister about this part? Is also an option. Basically, I would rather have it in one place, to be honest. I mean.
Okay, so if you organize that,
great, but we can start saying that we're going to bring Michael Hudson here in November.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah. Let's do that in November. No, not November, because
no.
December. Yeah.
You mean two more sessions?
No, one more in November and December. Michael Hudson.
Yeah, this is the October session.
Stop recording.
Great.
Yeah. So okay, Christian, do you want to tell, like, finalize the session so we can stop recording?
I will finalize the session. So thanks everybody for showing up, for listening and asking questions. I hope it was interesting, and hope to see you next time. I'll be updating the Google Doc with the stuff that's missing currently. I'll do this tomorrow, and I'll be starting to add new stuff for the next session, probably in like 10 to 15 days. So